The smoke rose black and vicious against the pale Arizona sky, twisting like a demon's finger pointing toward heaven. And Owen Thorne saw it from 3 miles away as he descended the mountain trail with his pack horse trailing behind him. It was late afternoon in August of 1878, and the heat had been relentless for weeks, turning the grasslands around Springerville into a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Owen had been up in the White Mountains for nearly 2 months, trapping and hunting, living in the silence that suited him better than any town ever could. His buckskin shirt clung to his broad shoulders, darkened with sweat, and his hair, brown and sun-streaked, hung past his collar in waves that caught the hot wind. His arms, thick with muscle from years of splitting wood and hauling game, flexed as he urged his horse into a faster pace. Something about that smoke spoke of wrongness, of urgency, and Owen Thorne had learned long ago to trust his instincts. As he drew closer, the smell hit him, acrid and choking, carrying on the wind the unmistakable scent of burning pine and something else, something that made his gut clench with worry. The cabin came into view, a small structure set back from the main road, flames already consuming the western wall and creeping toward the roof with hungry determination. Owen's horse balked at the heat, but he drove it forward, his eyes scanning the scene with the practiced assessment of a man who had survived more than his share of danger. That was when he heard it. Faint beneath the roar and crackle of the fire, a voice calling out, raw with desperation and weakening by the second. A woman's voice. Owen dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with a thud. He moved toward the cabin, his mind already calculating angles and possibilities, but as he reached the door, his hands found it locked from the outside. A heavy bar dropped across the frame. The realization sent ice through his veins despite the furnace heat washing over him. Someone had locked her in. This was no accident. There was no time for questions or rage, only action. Owen stepped back, raised his leg, and drove his boot into the door with all the force of his 200-pound frame behind it. The wood splintered, but held. Inside, the woman screamed again, and he could hear the terror in it, the kind of fear that came when death showed its face. He kicked again, harder, and this time the doorframe cracked, the bar breaking free. One more kick, and the door burst inward, releasing a wall of smoke and heat that nearly drove him back. Owen pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth and plunged inside. The interior was a nightmare of flames and darkness, smoke so thick he could barely see 3 feet ahead. He dropped low where the air was clearer and called out, his voice a deep rumble that cut through the chaos. "Where are you? Call out!" A cough, harsh and racking, came from his left. Owen crawled toward it, his eyes streaming, his lungs beginning to burn. He found her crumpled in the corner, her dress torn and dirty, her dark hair falling across her face as she struggled to breathe. She looked up at him with eyes wide and disbelieving, gray-green like storm clouds, and even through the terror he could see she was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with delicate features that were now smudged with soot and tight with pain. "I have you," Owen said, his voice rough but steady. "Hold on to me." He did not wait for her response. The roof beam above them groaned, and embers rained down like hellish snow. Owen scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how light she felt, how fragile against his chest, and then he was moving, driving back toward the door with single-minded determination. The fire reached for them, hungry and alive, but Owen Thorne had faced down grizzlies and winter storms that could freeze a man solid in an hour. He would not let this woman die. They burst through the doorway just as the roof collapsed behind them, sending up a shower of sparks and a wave of heat that singed the back of Owen's shirt. He did not stop until they were 50 yards clear, and then he went to his knees, laying her gently on the ground and pulling his canteen from his belt. Her eyes were closed now, her face pale beneath the soot, and for one terrible moment Owen thought they had been too late. But then she coughed, violent and painful, and her eyes fluttered open. Owen tipped water to her lips, supporting her head with his other hand, and she drank greedily, desperately, before another fit of coughing overtook her. "Easy," Owen murmured, his voice surprisingly gentle for such a large man. "Easy now. You are safe." She looked up at him, really looked at him, and Owen felt something shift in his chest, something he had not felt in the 5 years since he'd left civilization behind. Her lips moved, trying to form words, but only a whisper came out. "Thank you." Owen nodded, his jaw tight. "Who locked you in there?" Her expression changed, fear flashing across her features, and she glanced past him toward the road as if expecting to see someone coming. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, threaded with anger beneath the fear. "My husband." The words hung between them, and Owen felt his hands curl into fists. He had suspected something dark, but hearing it confirmed sent a cold fury through him. He forced himself to breathe, to think clearly. "Where is he now?" "I do not know," she said, pushing herself up to sitting, despite Owen's hand on her shoulder, urging her to rest. "He locked me in and rode off. He said—" Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting for control. "He said I was not worth the trouble anymore, that he would rather see me dead than let me leave." Owen's mind raced. If the husband had ridden off, he might be in town, establishing an alibi, or he might be waiting nearby to ensure the fire did its work. Either way, this woman was in danger, and she needed more help than Owen could provide, alone in the wilderness. "What is your name?" he asked. "Fiona," she said, meeting his eyes. "Fiona Kirby." Owen Thorne. He glanced back at the cabin, now fully engulfed, the flames reaching toward the sky like prayers that would never be answered. "We need to move. Can you ride?" Fiona nodded, though he could see the exhaustion in every line of her body. Owen helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed, and led her to his horse. The animal had calmed now that they were farther from the fire, and Owen lifted Fiona into the saddle with an ease that spoke of his strength. She settled there, gripping the pommel, and Owen swung up behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. "Where are we going?" Fiona asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the fire. "Springerville," Owen said. "You need a doctor, and we need the law." He could feel her tense at that, but she did not argue. Owen urged his horse into a steady trot, his pack-horse following on its lead, and they left the burning cabin behind. As they rode, he could feel Fiona trembling against him, whether from shock or fear or the aftermath of near death, he could not tell. Without thinking, Owen shifted slightly, pulling her more securely against his chest, offering what comfort he could. "You are safe now," he said again, and he meant it. Whatever it took, whoever her husband was, Owen Thorne would make sure Fiona Kirby stayed safe. The ride into Springerville took nearly 2 hours, and by the time they reached the outskirts of town, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed cruel in their beauty after what had happened. Fiona had not spoken much during the ride, but Owen could feel her breathing evening out, her body relaxing incrementally against his. He found himself acutely aware of her presence, the way she fit against him, the faint scent of smoke and something floral that clung to her hair. Springerville was a small town, maybe 300 souls on a good day, built around the promise of ranching and farming in the high country. Owen knew it only from occasional visits to trade his furs and stock up on supplies. He was not a man who enjoyed towns, with their noise and crowds and the way people looked at him, half curious and half wary, as if his size and his silence marked him as something dangerous. But now, as he rode down the main street with Fiona in his arms, Owen felt every eye turned toward them. He ignored the stairs and headed directly for the doctor's office, a small building near the center of town marked by a faded sign. He dismounted and lifted Fiona down, and this time, when her feet touched the ground, her legs buckled. Owen caught her easily, swinging her back up into his arms. "I can walk," Fiona protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," Owen agreed, "but you do not need to." He carried her inside, shouldering the door open, and found himself in a cramped waiting room that smelled of carbolic and old wood. A woman, middle-aged and stern-faced, looked up from a desk and immediately rose to her feet. "Good Lord, what happened?" "She was in a fire," Owen said. "She needs the doctor." The woman did not waste time with more questions. She disappeared through a doorway, and a moment later a man emerged, balding and bespectacled, with the quick, assessing eyes of someone used to emergencies. "Bring her through here," the doctor said, gesturing toward an examination room. Owen did as instructed, laying Fiona on the narrow bed. She looked up at him, and he saw something in her expression, a plea that she did not voice. Owen understood. She did not want to be alone. He turned to the doctor. "I will wait outside." "No," Fiona said, her hand reaching out to catch his wrist. Her fingers were small and soot-stained against his tanned skin. "Please, stay." The doctor glanced between them, his eyebrows rising slightly, but he nodded. "If the lady wants you here, you can stay. But stand back and let me work." Owen moved to the corner of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, and watched as the doctor began his examination. He asked Fiona questions in a low, calm voice, checking her breathing, looking at her eyes and throat, gently probing for injuries. Fiona answered in a voice that grew steadier as the minutes passed, and Owen found himself cataloging details about her that he had not noticed before. The way her hands moved when she spoke, graceful despite their trembling. The curve of her jaw, delicate but stubborn. The way she held herself, even now with a kind of dignity that spoke of inner strength. "You are lucky," the doctor said finally, straightening. "Your lungs sound clear, no serious burns. You will be coughing for a few days, and your throat will be sore, but you should make a full recovery." He paused, his expression sobering. "How did you end up in a burning building?" Fiona's eyes flicked to Owen, and he saw the fear return. Before she could speak, Owen stepped forward. "Her husband locked her inside," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Deliberately." The doctor's face went pale, then red with anger. "Martin Kirby did this?" So the husband was known in town. Owen filed that information away. Fiona nodded slowly, and Owen saw tears begin to track down her cheeks, leaving clean lines through the soot. "He's been angry for weeks," she said, her voice breaking. "I told him I wanted to leave, that I could not bear it anymore. The way he—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. "He said no wife of his would leave him, that if I tried, he would make sure I regretted it." The doctor muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse. He put a hand on Fiona's shoulder, his touch gentle. "You are safe now," he said. "I will send for Sheriff Dalton. Martin Kirby will answer for this." "No," Fiona said quickly, sitting up. "You do not understand. Martin knows everyone in this town. His family has been here for generations. Who will believe me over him?" Owen felt his jaw tighten. He knew the truth in her words. Small towns protected their own, and a man with family and history would always have an advantage over a woman with nothing but her word. But that did not mean Owen would let it stand. "I will testify," Owen said. "I saw the cabin burning. I heard you screaming. I found the door barred from the outside." Fiona looked at him, her eyes wide with something that might have been hope. "You would do that? You do not even know me." "I know enough," Owen said simply. The doctor nodded approvingly. "Then we will send for the sheriff together. In the meantime, Miss Fiona, you need rest. Do you have somewhere safe to stay?" The question hung in the air, and Owen saw Fiona's face fall. She shook her head slowly. "I have nowhere. Martin, he controlled everything. I have no money, no family." Owen made a decision then, one that surprised him even as the words left his mouth. "You can stay with me." Both Fiona and the doctor turned to look at him. Owen kept his expression carefully neutral, though inside he felt a flicker of uncertainty. What was he doing? He lived alone, had lived alone for years by choice. He was not a man suited for company, for the complications that came with it. But looking at Fiona, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, the trust she had already placed in him, Owen knew he could not simply walk away. "I have a camp," he continued, "up in the mountains, about an hour's ride from here. It is safe, and no one knows where it is. You can stay there until we sort this out." "I cannot ask that of you," Fiona said, but Owen could hear the hope in her voice. "You are not asking. I am offering." The doctor looked between them, clearly weighing proprieties against practicalities. Finally, he sighed. "It might be for the best, at least for tonight. Martin Kirby is a dangerous man if what you say is true, Fiona. He will not take kindly to his plans being thwarted. But," he looked at Owen sternly, "people will talk." "Let them," Owen said with a shrug. He had never cared much what people thought of him. Fiona was quiet for a long moment, and Owen could see her weighing her options. Finally, she nodded. "I accept. Thank you, Owen." Hearing his name from her lips did something strange to Owen's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the August heat. He nodded once, gruff and businesslike, trying to ignore the feeling. The doctor provided Fiona with a clean shirt and trousers, more practical for riding than her torn dress, and some salve for the minor burns on her arms. While she changed behind a screen, Owen stepped outside to check on his horses and to give her privacy. The sun was lower now, the street quieter as people headed home for supper. Owen stood in the fading light, his mind turning over everything that had happened. He had come down from the mountain expecting a quiet evening, maybe a hot meal and a soft bed at the boarding house before heading back up to his camp. Instead, he had saved a woman's life, made an enemy of a man he had never met, and invited that woman to share his solitude. It was not like him, this impulsiveness. Owen Thorne was a man who thought things through, who weighed consequences and risks. But when he thought of Fiona's face as she looked up at him through the smoke, when he remembered the trust in her eyes, Owen knew he would make the same choice again. The door opened behind him, and Fiona emerged, looking strange and young in the borrowed clothes. They were too large for her small frame, but she had rolled up the sleeves and tied a piece of rope around her waist to keep the trousers up. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, still tangled but cleaner where she had wiped away the soot. "Ready?" Owen asked. Fiona nodded. "Yes, but Owen, we should tell the sheriff first before we leave town." Owen considered this and agreed. They walked together down the street, Owen leading his horses, and found the sheriff's office near the saloon. The sheriff, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a graying mustache, listened to their story with an expression that grew increasingly grim. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "That is a serious accusation, madam," Sheriff Dalton said, looking at Fiona. "You are saying Martin Kirby tried to kill you?" "I'm not saying it, Sheriff. It is the truth. He locked me in that cabin and set it on fire." "Did you see him set the fire?" Fiona hesitated. "No, but he locked me in, and when I heard the flames, I called out. He did not come back. He left me there to die." The sheriff looked at Owen. "And you found her how?" "I was coming down from the mountains and saw the smoke. When I got there, I heard her calling for help. The door was barred from the outside." "Could have been an accident," the sheriff said, though his tone suggested he did not believe it. "Bar could have fallen into place." "The bar was dropped deliberately," Owen said, his voice hard. "I know the difference." The sheriff sighed and rubbed his face. "Look, I will talk to Martin, ask him some questions. But you need to understand. The Kirby family has deep roots here. I cannot just arrest a man on an accusation." "Even when that man tried to murder his wife?" Owen asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Even then," the sheriff said, meeting Owen's eyes without flinching. "Not without proof, but I will investigate. You have my word on that." It was not enough, but Owen knew it was all they would get for now. He nodded curtly and turned to leave, Fiona following. Once outside, she let out a shaky breath. "He will not do anything," she said. "Martin will lie, and his family will support him, and nothing will change." "Maybe," Owen said, "but you are alive, and that is what matters right now. We will figure out the rest." They mounted his horse again, Fiona settling in front of Owen, and this time the ride felt different. The urgency was gone, replaced by something quieter, but no less intense. Owen was aware of every point where their bodies touched, the way Fiona leaned back against him as they climbed into the foothills, trusting him to keep her safe. Night fell as they rode, the stars emerging overhead in a brilliant display that no town could match. Owen guided his horse along trails he knew by heart, even in the dark, and finally they reached his camp, a small clearing beside a creek with a lean-to shelter and a fire pit ringed with stones. Owen helped Fiona down and set about making camp with practiced efficiency. He built a fire, the flames catching quickly on the dry wood, and then set coffee to boil while Fiona sat on a log, watching him with exhausted eyes. "You should eat something," Owen said, pulling jerky and hardtack from his packs. It was not much, but it would do for tonight. Tomorrow he would hunt fresh meat. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the soft burble of the creek. When they finished, Owen spread his bedroll near the fire and gestured to it. "You take that. I will sleep under the stars." Fiona looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion won out. She lay down on the bedroll, pulling Owen's blanket over herself, and within minutes her breathing had evened out into sleep. Owen watched her for a moment, the firelight playing across her features, and felt that strange tightness in his chest again. He moved away from the fire, finding a spot where he could lean against a tree and still keep watch. Sleep would come eventually, but for now, Owen was content to sit in the darkness and think about the woman who had appeared in his life like a storm, unexpected and transformative. The next morning arrived with the scent of pine and the sound of birds calling to each other in the trees. Owen woke before dawn, as was his habit, and found Fiona still asleep by the fire, which had burned down to embers. He rebuilt it quietly, set coffee on to boil, and then took his rifle and headed into the woods. Within an hour, he had shot 2 rabbits, and he returned to camp to find Fiona awake, sitting by the fire with the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "Good morning," she said, her voice still rough from the smoke. "Morning," Owen replied. He set about skinning and preparing the rabbits, his movements quick and sure. Fiona watched him for a moment, then stood and came to join him. "Can I help?" Owen glanced at her, surprised. Most women he had known would have been squeamish about such work, but Fiona looked at the rabbits with a practical eye. "You know how?" "I grew up on a farm in Kansas," Fiona said. Before I made the mistake of thinking marriage would be better than hard work and solitude." There was bitterness in her voice, but also a strength that Owen admired. "I can clean game and cook over a fire as well as anyone." Owen handed her his skinning knife without a word, and they worked together in companionable silence. Once the rabbits were prepared, Fiona spitted them over the fire while Owen poured coffee into 2 tin cups. They sat together, waiting for the meat to cook, and Owen found himself wanting to know more about this woman who had crashed into his life. "Why did you marry him?" he asked, then immediately wondered if he had overstepped. But Fiona did not seem offended. She stared into the fire, her expression distant. "I was 19, she said. "My parents had died the year before influenza, and I was alone. Martin came through our town buying cattle, and he seemed kind, attentive. He courted me properly, said all the right things, and I thought—" She paused, her jaw tightening. "I thought I was lucky. He was older, established, and he wanted me. It was only after we married and came here to Arizona that I saw his true nature." "He hurt you," Owen said, not a question. "Not with his fists, not at first," Fiona said quietly, "but with his words, with his control. He made me feel small, worthless. He said I was lucky he had married me, that no one else would have wanted me. And when I finally found the courage to say I wanted to leave, that I could not live that way anymore, he became violent. That is when I knew I had to get away, but he would not let me go." Owen felt anger burning in his gut, hot and fierce. He had seen men like Martin Kirby before, men who used their strength to dominate rather than protect. It sickened him. "He will not touch you again," Owen said, his voice hard as granite. "I promise you that." Fiona turned to look at him, and in the morning light, her eyes were the color of sage after rain. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "You do not know me. You owe me nothing." Owen was quiet for a moment, trying to find words for feelings he did not fully understand himself. "I know what it is like to feel trapped," he said finally, "to want freedom and have someone try to take it from you. I will not stand by and let that happen to you." There was more he could have said, about how seeing her in that burning cabin had done something to him, about how having her here in his camp felt right in a way nothing had felt right in years. But Owen was not a man of many words, and he hoped she understood what he could not say. They ate their breakfast slowly, the rabbits roasted to perfection, and afterward Fiona insisted on washing the utensils in the creek while Owen checked his traps. When he returned, he found her sitting on a rock by the water, her bare feet dangling in the current, her face tilted up to the sun. She looked younger this way, peaceful, and Owen felt something shift in his heart, a door opening that he had thought sealed shut. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Owen hunted and checked his trap lines, while Fiona kept the camp, cooking and mending and making the rough shelter feel more like a home than it ever had. They talked in the evenings, sitting by the fire, and Owen found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone, about his childhood in Missouri, the way his father had died in the war and his mother had remarried a man who had no use for another man's son, about how Owen had left home at 16 and headed west, finding work where he could, learning to survive in the wilderness. Fiona shared her own stories about growing up on the Kansas prairie, about her dreams of becoming a school teacher before circumstances had forced her into a marriage she had not wanted. She spoke of the loneliness of the past 4 years, the way Martin had isolated her from everyone in town, making her dependent on him for everything. "I swore to myself," Fiona said one night, her voice fierce, "that if I ever got free, I would never let anyone control me again. I would rather live alone for the rest of my life than give up my freedom. Owen understood that, respected it. But he also saw the way Fiona looked at him sometimes, the softness in her eyes when she thought he was not watching. And he felt his own defenses crumbling, the walls he had built around his heart beginning to crack. 2 weeks passed in this way, and Owen knew they could not hide in the mountains forever. Sooner or later they would need to return to town, to face whatever consequences awaited them. But he found himself reluctant to leave, to break the spell of these quiet days and nights with Fiona by his side. It was Fiona who finally brought it up. They were sitting by the fire one evening, the stars brilliant overhead, when she turned to Owen with a determined expression. "We need to go back to Springerville," she said. "I cannot hide up here forever, and I need to know what Martin is telling people. I need to clear my name." Owen wanted to argue, to tell her she could stay here as long as she wanted, that he would keep her safe. But he knew she was right. Fiona was not a woman who would hide, not now that she had found her courage. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "We will go tomorrow." That night, Owen found himself unable to sleep. He lay on his bedroll, staring up at the stars, listening to Fiona's soft breathing from across the fire. He thought about what would happen when they returned to town, about the possibility that Martin Kirby might try to hurt her again. The thought made Owen's hands curl into fists, a protective fury rising in him that was primal and undeniable. He cared for her, more than cared. In 2 weeks, Fiona had become essential to him in a way he could not explain, could not rationalize. She had brought light into his solitary existence, had made him remember what it was like to want something beyond simple survival. And if Owen was honest with himself, he wanted her. Not just in his bed, though he would not deny that desire burned in him, but in his life, in his days and nights, in all the moments that made up a life shared. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home. They rode into Springerville the next afternoon, and Owen felt the tension in Fiona's body as they entered the town. Eyes followed them, and Owen heard whispers, saw people pointing. News had spread, as it always did in small towns. By the time they reached the doctor's office, a small crowd had gathered. Dr. Harrison came out to meet them, his expression worried. "Fiona, Owen, I'm glad you're back. Things have been complicated." "What do you mean?" Fiona asked, dismounting with Owen's help. "Eeked. Martin has been telling everyone that you ran off with a mountain man," the doctor said, glancing apologetically at Owen. "He says you were having an affair, that the fire was an accident, and that you used it as an excuse to leave him. He has half the town convinced he is the victim in all this." Fiona's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "That's a lie. All of it." "I know," the doctor said gently. "But Martin is persuasive, and he has friends. The sheriff questioned him, but without proof, there's nothing he can do." Owen felt his jaw tighten. "Where is Kirby now?" "At the saloon, last I heard. Owen, do not do anything foolish. Martin is looking for an excuse to turn this into something worse." But Owen was already moving, his long strides eating up the distance to the saloon. He heard Fiona calling his name, heard her running to catch up, but the fury in him had found a target, and he would not be deterred. He pushed through the saloon doors, his eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The place fell silent as he entered, all eyes turning to him. Owen scanned the room and found Martin Kirby at the bar, a man of medium height and soft around the middle, with thinning hair and a weak chin. He looked nothing like Owen had imagined, nothing like a man capable of the cruelty Fiona had described. But Owen knew that evil did not always come in obvious packages. "Martin Kirby," Owen said, his voice carrying across the room. Martin turned, his expression shifting from surprise to something calculating. "You must be the mountain man," he said, his voice dripping with false friendliness, "the one who has been keeping my wife." "Your wife," Owen said slowly, "who you locked in a burning cabin." The room erupted in murmurs. Martin held up his hands, his expression wounded. "That is a lie. I do not know what Fiona told you, but she has always had a flair for the dramatic. The fire was an accident. I tried to save her, but she had already run off." "Then explain why the door was barred from the outside," Owen said, taking a step closer. Martin's eyes flicked away just for a moment. "It must have fallen when I ran to get help." "Liar." The word came from behind Owen, and he turned to see Fiona standing in the doorway, her chin raised defiantly. She walked into the saloon, ignoring the shocked gasps from the men present. Women did not enter saloons, not proper women, but Fiona clearly did not care. "You locked me in that cabin, Martin," Fiona said, her voice shaking but strong. "You told me I would never leave you, that you would rather see me dead, and then you set the fire and rode away." "She is lying," Martin said, appealing to the crowd. "She wants to be with him," he pointed at Owen, "and she is willing to destroy my reputation to do it." "Your reputation," Fiona said, her voice rising, "is worth nothing. You are a coward and a liar. You have hurt me for the last time." Martin's expression changed then, the mask slipping, and Owen saw the cruelty beneath. Martin took a step toward Fiona, his hand raised, and Owen moved without thinking. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and caught Martin's wrist, his grip iron hard. "Touch her, and I will break your arm," Owen said quietly. Martin tried to pull free, but he might as well have tried to move a mountain. Owen held him easily, and when Martin looked up into his eyes, whatever he saw there made him go pale. "Let him go, Thorne!" The voice came from the doorway, and Owen turned to see Sheriff Dalton standing there, his hand on his gun. "This is not helping anyone." Owen released Martin with a shove that sent the smaller man stumbling back. The sheriff moved between them, his expression grim. "This has gone far enough," Dalton said. "Martin, Fiona, both of you need to come with me. We are going to sort this out properly." At the sheriff's office, statements were taken again, this time with several witnesses present. Owen recounted what he had seen and heard, his testimony clear and unwavering. Fiona told her story, her voice steady despite the tears that occasionally slipped down her cheeks. Martin maintained his innocence, but as the questioning continued, his story began to change, small inconsistencies appearing that the sheriff noted carefully. Finally, after more than an hour, Sheriff Dalton leaned back in his chair and looked at Martin with hard eyes. I have been asking around," the sheriff said. "Turns out several people heard you and Fiona arguing the day of the fire. Mrs. Patterson from the general store says you were shouting at Fiona, telling her she would regret trying to leave you. That does not sound like a loving husband worried about his wife." Martin's face reddened. "A man has a right to discipline his wife." "Not by trying to kill her," the sheriff said flatly. He stood, his hand moving to the handcuffs at his belt. "Martin Kirby, I am arresting you on suspicion of attempted murder." The room erupted. Martin lunged to his feet, shouting protests, but the sheriff moved quickly, restraining him with the ease of long practice. As Martin was led away, still shouting threats and accusations, Fiona swayed on her feet. Owen was there instantly, his arm around her waist, supporting her. "It is over," he murmured. "You are safe." Fiona turned her face into his chest and wept, her body shaking with the release of weeks of fear and tension. Owen held her, his large hands gentle on her back, and felt his heart break for what she had endured. But beneath the sympathy was relief, fierce and overwhelming. She was safe, she was free, and Owen would make sure she stayed that way. The trial came swiftly by frontier standards, held within 2 weeks. The judge was a circuit rider, a stern man with no patience for men who hurt women. Owen testified, as did several townspeople who had heard the arguments between Martin and Fiona, who had seen the bruises Fiona sometimes tried to hide beneath long sleeves. The evidence, once people began to speak, was damning. Martin Kirby was found guilty of attempted murder and sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. As he was led away, he looked at Fiona with such hatred that Owen instinctively stepped in front of her, blocking the view. Martin said nothing, but the promise of vengeance was clear in his eyes. After the trial, Fiona stood outside the courthouse, blinking in the bright sunlight as if seeing the world for the first time. Owen stood beside her, patient and steady, and when she finally turned to look at him, there were tears in her eyes. "I do not know what to do now," she said quietly. "I have no money, no home. The cabin is gone, and even if it were not, I could never go back there." Owen had been thinking about this, turning it over in his mind during the long night since they had returned to town. He had been staying at the boarding house, giving Fiona space to stay with the doctor's wife, who had kindly offered her a room. But he had missed her, missed the easy companionship they had found in the mountains, and he knew with a certainty that settled in his bones that he did not want to let her go. "Come back to the mountains with me," Owen said. It was not eloquent, not romantic, but it was honest. "Stay with me, Fiona looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Owen, I will not be dependent on another man. I need to stand on my own. I know, Owen said, and I would never ask you to give up your freedom. But Fiona, He struggled with the words, unused to speaking his heart. These weeks with you have been the best of my life. I do not want them to end. Stay with me, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to, because this thing between us, this feeling, is worth exploring. What feeling? Fiona asked, but her voice was soft, hopeful. Owen took a breath, forcing himself to be brave. I am falling in love with you, he said simply. Maybe I have been since the moment I carried you out of that fire. I know it is fast. I know you have just escaped one marriage and might not want to think about another man. But I'm not Martin. I would never try to control you or hurt you. I would spend every day making sure you knew you were valued, respected, cherished. If you will let me. Fiona's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. You saved my life, she said, and in the weeks since, you've given me back something I thought I had lost, my sense of self, my strength. You never tried to make me smaller, Owen. You let me be who I am, and you respected that. How could I not fall in love with you too? Owen felt his heart stutter in his chest. You do? Yes, Fiona said, laughing through her tears. I do. I love you, Owen Thorne. You are the best man I have ever known. Owen did not trust himself to speak. Instead, he closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands, his calloused palms gentle against her soft skin. He kissed her then, slowly and carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. Fiona sighed against his lips and kissed him back, her hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally pulled apart, Owen rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in. Marry me, he said. Not because you need to, but because you want to. Be my wife, my partner. Build a life with me. Yes, Fiona said without hesitation. Yes, Owen, I will marry you. They were married a week later in a simple ceremony at the town church. Dr. Harrison stood as Owen's witness, and Mrs. Harrison stood for Fiona. The bride wore a dress borrowed from the preacher's wife, simple blue cotton that made her eyes shine like storm clouds lit by lightning. Owen wore his cleanest buckskin shirt and trousers, his hair tied back, and when he saw Fiona walking toward him down the aisle, he felt his breath catch in his throat. She was beautiful, radiant, and she was his. The preacher spoke words about love and commitment, about two becoming one, and Owen meant every word of his vows, to love, to honor, to cherish, to protect and provide, to be faithful through all the days of their lives. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Owen kissed Fiona with a tenderness that made several of the women in attendance dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. They had a small celebration at the boarding house, the townspeople warming to Fiona now that her story was known, now that Martin's cruelty had been exposed. There was food and music, and Owen danced with his wife, awkward and careful, his large hands holding her as if she were made of spun glass. Fiona laughed up at him, her eyes bright with joy, and Owen thought he had never seen anything more beautiful. As the sun began to set, they said their goodbyes and rode out of town together, heading back to the mountains. This time, Fiona rode her own horse, a gentle mare that Owen had purchased for her with some of his saved money. They rode side by side through the twilight, and when they reached Owen's camp, he helped her down and led her to the shelter. He had worked hard over the past week, expanding it, building a proper cabin with walls and a roof and a door that closed. It was small, just one room, but it had a real bed that Owen had built himself, and a stone fireplace, and windows that let in the light. Fiona stood in the doorway, looking around with wide eyes, and then she turned to Owen with a smile that lit up her entire face. You built this? For us? For you, Owen said. I want you to be comfortable. I know it is not much, but I will keep improving it. I will build you a proper house with rooms and a porch and whatever you want. Fiona crossed to him and put her arms around his waist, resting her head against his chest. It is perfect, she said, because it is ours. That night, Owen made love to his wife with a gentleness and reverence that brought tears to Fiona's eyes. He was careful with her, knowing this was nothing like what she had experienced with Martin, wanting to show her that intimacy could be beautiful, could be an expression of love and respect. Fiona responded to his touch with a passion that surprised and delighted him, and afterward they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, her head on his shoulder, his hand stroking through her hair. "I never knew it could be like this," Fiona whispered into the darkness. "I never knew I could feel this way." Owen kissed the top of her head. "Neither did I," he admitted. "I thought I would spend my life alone. I never expected you." "Are you sorry?" Fiona asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. "Not for a single moment," Owen said seriously. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Fiona Thorne." The months that followed were the happiest of Owen's life. He and Fiona fell into a rhythm, working together to build their life in the mountains. Owen hunted and trapped while Fiona tended a small garden she had planted near the cabin, coaxing vegetables from the mountain soil with determination and skill. They talked for hours by the fire, sharing dreams and plans for the future. Owen taught Fiona to shoot, and she proved to be a natural, her aim steady and true. Fiona taught Owen to read better, patiently working through books they had purchased in town, and Owen discovered a love for stories he had never known he possessed. Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in October. Owen had prepared well, stocking the cabin with supplies, cutting wood for the fire, salting and smoking meat. They were snug and warm in their little cabin, and on the long winter nights, Owen held his wife close and thanked whatever providence had led him down that mountain trail on the day of the fire. In the spring, Fiona told him she was pregnant. Owen felt his knees go weak with the news, a mixture of joy and terror flooding through him. He would be a father. He would have a child to protect and raise, to teach and guide. The responsibility was enormous, but when he looked at Fiona, saw the happiness shining in her eyes, Owen knew he would do everything in his power to be a good father, to give his child the love and security he had never had. Their son was born in December, during a snowstorm that blanketed the mountains in white. Dr. Harrison had ridden up 2 weeks before the birth at Fiona's request, staying in a small tent near the cabin, and his presence gave both Owen and Fiona peace of mind. The labor was long and difficult, and Owen paced outside the cabin like a caged bear, listening to Fiona's cries and feeling helpless in a way he had never experienced before. But when the doctor finally emerged with a squalling bundle wrapped in blankets, when Owen held his son for the first time and looked down into that tiny, perfect face, everything else fell away. The baby had Owen's dark hair and Fiona's delicate features, and when he wrapped his tiny hand around Owen's finger, Owen felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. "What should we name him?" Fiona asked from the bed, exhausted but glowing with happiness. Owen thought for a moment, looking at his son. "Thomas," he said, "after my father, Thomas Thorne." "Thomas," Fiona repeated, smiling. "It is perfect." The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their family. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his father's quiet strength and his mother's quick mind. 3 years after Thomas was born, a daughter arrived whom they named Lily. She had her mother's gray-green eyes and a spirit as wild and free as the mountains themselves. Owen proved to be a devoted father, patient and loving, teaching his children to respect the wilderness that was their home while keeping them safe from its dangers. Owen and Fiona expanded the cabin, adding rooms as their family grew, and eventually Owen built a proper barn for their horses and the cow they had purchased. Fiona started a small school, teaching not only her own children, but also the children of the few other families who lived in the high country. She proved to be an excellent teacher, patient and creative, and Owen was proud beyond measure to see her thriving, using her gifts to help others. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, Owen thought about the day he had found Fiona in that burning cabin. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like something that had happened to different people. But then he would look at his wife, see the strength and joy in her eyes, and he would remember. They had both been saved that day, not just Fiona from the fire, but Owen from his solitude, his conviction that he was meant to walk through life alone. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Owen took Fiona back to the spot where their cabin now stood, where once there had been only his rough shelter. The children were spending the night with a neighboring family, and Owen and Fiona had the evening to themselves. They sat by the fire, as they had so many times before, Fiona leaning against Owen, his arm around her shoulders. "Do you ever regret it?" Owen asked quietly. Marrying me, living up here away from town? Fiona turned to look at him, her eyebrows raised in surprise. Regret it? Owen, these have been the best years of my life. You gave me freedom and love and a family. You gave me a home. How could I possibly regret any of that? I just want you to be happy, Owen said. I want you to know that if you ever want something different, something more, you only need to say so. Fiona reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her touch gentle. I'm happy, she said firmly. I'm exactly where I want to be, with exactly who I want to be with. You are my home, Owen Thorne. You and our children. Nothing else matters. Owen kissed her then, pouring all his love and gratitude into that kiss, and Fiona responded with the passion that had never dimmed between them. Later, as they lay together beneath the stars that shone through the cabin window, Owen thought about the journey that had brought them here. The fire that had almost taken Fiona's life had instead forged a bond between them that nothing could break. As the years continued to pass, Owen and Fiona watched their children grow. Thomas became a skilled hunter and tracker, following in his father's footsteps, while Lily proved to have a gift for healing, spending hours with her mother learning about the plants and herbs that grew in the mountains. They were good children, kind and strong, and Owen knew that was Fiona's doing as much as his own. When Owen was 45 and Fiona 42, they became grandparents for the first time. Thomas had married a young woman from Springerville, a rancher's daughter named Clara, and they had a son whom they named Owen after his grandfather. Holding his grandson for the first time, feeling that tiny weight in his arms, Owen was overcome with emotion. He thought of his own father, dead before Owen had really known him, and made a silent promise to be present in this child's life, to be the grandfather he had never had himself. Life in the mountains had its hardships. There was no denying that. Winters could be brutal, summers blazingly hot. There were droughts and floods, illnesses and injuries. But through it all, Owen and Fiona faced each challenge together, their love deepening with each passing year. They grew old together, their hair turning gray, their hands becoming gnarled with age, but the light in their eyes when they looked at each other never dimmed. On a spring day when Owen was 63, he and Fiona sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. Their children and grandchildren had visited that day, filling the house with laughter and noise, but now it was quiet again, just the two of them as it had been in the beginning. Do you remember the day we met? Fiona asked, her hand finding Owen's. Every detail, Owen said. I saw the smoke from miles away. I did not know what I would find when I got there, but I never imagined it would be you. You saved my life that day, Fiona said softly. You saved mine too, Owen replied. I was just existing before you, Fiona. You taught me how to live. Fiona leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the light fade from the sky. Owen thought about the life they had built together, about the love that had sustained them through good times and bad. He thought about the children they had raised, the grandchildren who bore their names and carried their legacy forward. He had been a solitary man once, content with his own company, asking nothing from life but the freedom to roam. But then a fire had brought him a woman locked in a cabin, desperate and afraid, and everything had changed. Owen had broken down that door and carried Fiona to safety, but in doing so, he had found his own salvation. She had shown him that love was not a trap or a burden, but a gift, freely given and received. She had shown him that he was capable of tenderness as well as strength, of partnership as well as independence. As the stars began to emerge overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their wedding night all those years ago, Owen squeezed Fiona's hand and felt her squeeze back. They did not need words. Everything they needed to say was in that touch, in the decades of shared history, in the love that had carried them through fire and smoke to this moment of perfect peace. Their story had begun with an act of courage and desperation, with flames and fear and the determination to survive. But it had become something beautiful, something lasting. It had become a testament to the power of love to transform, to heal, to make whole. Owen and Fiona had found each other in the worst of circumstances, but they had built the best of lives together. As they sat there on the porch, two people who had become one through years of love and commitment, Owen Thorne knew he was the luckiest man alive. He had found his purpose, his partner, his home. He had found everything he had never known he needed, all because he had followed the smoke to a burning cabin and discovered the woman who would change his life forever. The night deepened around them, and still they sat, two souls intertwined, watching the mountains they loved and holding tight to the love they had fought so hard to build. Their journey had not been easy, but it had been worth every moment, every struggle, every triumph. And as Owen looked at his wife, seeing in her weathered face the young woman he had carried from the flames, he knew that he would make the same choice again and again for all eternity. This was their happily ever after, hard-won and deeply cherished, and it was everything Owen had never dared to dream. The mountain man who had lived alone had found his heart's home in the arms of a woman brave enough to survive fire and strong enough to love without fear. Together, they had built a life rich in love, laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had found in each other exactly what they needed. The years would continue to pass, and eventually their time on earth would end. But the love between Owen and Fiona Thorne would live on in their children and grandchildren, in the stories told around fires on cold winter nights, in the legacy of courage and devotion they left behind. They had proven that even in the harsh world of the frontier, even after betrayal and pain, love could flourish and endure. And that, Owen thought as he held his wife close beneath the stars, was the greatest gift of all.